This episode is brought to you by Loom, now part of Atlassian. Loom lets you record your screen, your camera, and your voice to share messages easily.
I'm Yasmin Gagne.
I'm Josh Christensen.
And this is Most Innovative Companies. On today's episode, we talk to Fast Company staff writer Pavithra Mohan about return to office mandates.
Productivity theater is really the goal here, not true productivity.
Mark Wilson, our global design editor, talks about the long-lived legacy of the video game Sims.
The key is that you're taking care of something else. And that's really that's the anchor.
And as always, keeping tabs.
I'm usually pretty cynical about awards shows. It was an enjoyable awards show.
But first, here's the download, the news you need to know this week in the world of business and innovation.
The long-promised tariffs on Mexico and Canada finally went into effect on Tuesday. But then on Wednesday, President Trump announced a 30-day exemption for automakers. And then by Thursday, he had postponed almost the entirety of the 25% tariffs on both countries by yet another month. So we're going to do this all again on April 2nd. Somewhat predictably, the stock market has been volatile this week. On Tuesday, after the announcement of the tariffs going into effect, the Dow dropped more than 650 total points, only to recover slightly on Wednesday and then fall again on Thursday. We are recording this at 3:22 on Thursday, so this story could possibly change by the time you hear this. So to keep up to date on all tariff news, go to fastcompany.com.
Great news for the true freaks you know. This past Sunday, President Trump announced plans for the creation of a crypto strategic reserve. The plan, which he announced on Truth Social, would have the U.S. government hold tokens of Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP, Solana, and Cardano. The prices of these coins quickly soared in value after the announcement, but of course, just 48 hours later, that value crashed yet again.
I just want them to get thumb drives all filled with digital wallets of Fartcoin from Pump.Fun and put them in Fort Knox.
You're obsessed with Pump.Fun.
I am obsessed with Pump.Fun because I think it's insane. It's the most ridiculous platform. And Pump.Fun is based on the Solana exchange. So, literally, we are creating a strategic reserve of shitcoins.
Hell yeah. This feels right for the moment.
Oh, God. Well, let's transition to something less shadowy. American investment company BlackRock. American investment company BlackRock is stepping in to purchase two ports, which are located on either end of the Panama Canal, from Hong Kong company CK Hutchinson. The deal is worth roughly $19 billion, according to reports. These ports have been central to President Trump's complaints about the canal and his very odd desire for the U.S. to retake control of it. I feel like Greenland has very much taken the shine from President Trump recently. You haven't heard as much about Panama, but it's still there. True. The desire's still there.
So I recently tried to point out Panama Canal on a map and
did not go well.
That didn't go super well for me, but that's okay.
Greenland's a little easier for me.
Greenland, I can do Greenland.
I forget who I was listening to, but they were like, did the old Vikings trick of naming Greenland, Greenland, and Iceland, Iceland work on President Trump all these years later? It's like, green. We want the green one, right?
We want the green one. Yeah, not the ice one. Walgreens, the national pharmacy chain, is close to closing a deal with private equity firm Sycamore Partners to take the company private for around $10 billion. If the sale goes through, the retail portion of Walgreens will remain, but other parts of the company may be sold off or taken public. Walgreens has been struggling for years, with its current market value sitting at $8.9 billion, a far cry from its peak value in 2015 of $100 billion. It's because your dad retired, right?
I know. Disclosure, my dad worked for Walgreens for 45 years, and it was my first part-time job in high school.
It's because you left.
Yeah, it's because I left, yeah. Gary retires in 2021. Josh left in 2007. That's really when it all started going downhill. In other news from the retail space, Kroger chairman and CEO Rodney McMullen resigned this week after an internal probe into his personal conduct. The grocery store chain found that McMullen's conduct was inconsistent with Kroger's business ethics policy. McMullen had started his career as a part-time stock clerk at Kroger in 1978, working his way up to CEO in 2014 and chairman in 2015. Just imagine, I could have stayed at Walgreens, worked my way up to CEO, and then got fired for gross misconduct.
And finally, in news you can't really use, the SEC... The SEC has closed its investigation into Yuga Labs, the creator of the Bored Ape Yacht Club NFT collection, without taking enforcement action. So all those
stupid-looking pictures that
JPEG
the worst
holders
people you know
rejoice.
NFTs are the stupidest thing in the world. Really saved the metaverses. Like, the metaverse really avoided some smoke because NFTs were around the same time, I think.
Do you remember when Facebook renamed itself Meta? Like, now we just say Meta and move on.
I know, yeah.
But if you stop and think about the metaverse, it was like, what?
Man, turns out if you have a high enough valuation, you can do just about anything and survive. NVIDIA could come out tomorrow and be like, we're getting into NFTs and still be valued at $3 trillion. Yeah, I'd be like, whatever, it's fine.
Remember when the Wall Street Journal sent someone to walk around the metaverse, Meta's metaverse, and there was just no one there?
Yeah. That's awesome. I wonder, can you still go to the metaverse? Can I go to the metaverse?
We gotta try. We gotta try.
Live podcast from the metaverse.
Yuga Labs had been under SEC scrutiny since 2022 over whether its NFT offerings and ApeCoin tokens were securities or not. The company called the decision, sorry, this is funny, a huge win for the NFT industry. Huge.
It's going to make all the difference. NFTs are back. And that's the news you need to know today.
So, Josh, how did you feel when we had to return to the office?
I was kind of ready for it at that point in the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic was hard. You didn't see a lot of people. I think I needed some social interaction and to be back in the office to an extent. That being said, never do I want to go back to the office 5 days a week ever in my life again. I like having remote days. I like having flexibility, but I kind of needed it. I needed to see people. I needed to be out in the world. So I was ready for it. You are more of a homebody than I am. Are you still salty about coming back to office?
Well, so there's some confounding variables here. Right when return to office got announced, I got really sick.
Oh yeah,
and I feel
that's
I've
true.
been
on
and off sick for a while, so it's also working from home was just a lot easier for me from that perspective.
Yeah,
and is generally I get migraines. I'm it's just so much easier to deal with here. The thing that gets me is actually when we first had to lock down, I was really sad that we couldn't go to the office anymore. I was I have a routine. I like going into the office every day. I totally understand, make my lunch every night to bring it into the office, whatever. But now I realize I go to the office, I'm distracted all day, and then I come home and work.
Yeah, that's true.
And especially when, you have a lot of meetings because you're a manager, right?
Yeah, I do.
But for me, I have a bunch of external meetings that are really useful, but a lot of my job is editing and writing. It's so much easier to do from home.
Yeah, it really depends on what the balance of your job is. There are legitimately a number of things that are easier for me to get done in the office.
Well, you're managing a team, right? I think that makes total sense.
Yeah. But then there are large parts of my job that are editing and writing too.
Yeah.
And that is so hard for me to do in the office because I'm constantly distracted.
Totally.
Now, also I have a production heavy job as well. I'm EPing different shows and we're recording in the studio that we have in office. So there's things that I literally can't do outside of the office. So that's another confounding factor, to use your language. But I think everyone's pretty much come around except for C-suite people, I think, that hybrid and flexible work policies are usually the way to go. If you're good to work remote and you're doing your job well, you should probably be able to stay remote. If you want to be in the office 5 days a week, go do it. But mandating people back in the office 5 days a week, I think is stupid. But someone much smarter about this is going to take us through all of this.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I will say one thing. I feel like the people who assume that their workers do nothing at home when they work from home are the people who do nothing when they work from home. You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
exactly. You're telling on yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, anyway. So if it hasn't already happened to you, you've certainly heard about it. Along with the federal workforce, private companies are increasingly calling their employees back to full-time in-person work. These are known as return to office mandates or RTOs. And while many companies are getting vocal pushback, with some bosses very vocally pushing back against that pushback, here's looking at you, Jamie Dimon, what they may be failing to consider are the legal ramifications they are leaving themselves open to. We're talking about the potential pitfalls and liabilities for employers with Pavithra Mohan, a staff writer for Fast Company's Work Life section. So, Pavithra, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we've seen companies like Amazon, we've seen places like the federal government under Trump issue return to office mandates that are coming for a lot of employees now. What is driving the return to office push?
I feel like that is the big question because most of these companies, when they say that they want to do this, they give some sort of vague rationale about collaboration and productivity. So I think there's, first of all, a lack of clarity as to why companies are doing this. I think it's pretty obvious that it's coming from, the CEOs and the C-suite, and that there is a desire to kind of see people in the office, right? Like sort of productivity theater is really the goal here, not true productivity. And in many cases, it's like a complete about face from what they said during COVID, right? When they said that they could work productively from home. In some cases, Amazon being one of them, the CEO had explicitly said, we don't see a reason to go back to the office. We've been doing things just fine with our hybrid policy. And then a year later, things completely changed. And so I think to some extent, it's just that there is pressure, I think, on certain industries in particular, like finance comes to mind, where one company does this, then another, and these CEOs are like, all right, we have to do this because every company in our sector is going back to the office full time. But I think that is the thing that employees are finding so frustrating, right? Is they feel like there is no real reason for this. And even these companies that are historically very metrics oriented and driven by that are not really giving any clear rationale for why they're doing this.
Specifically when it comes to Amazon, I mean, something that I certainly heard a lot of is people saying it's a way of doing layoffs, basically, without laying people off. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely some truth to that. A lot of these companies really overhired during the pandemic. And in some cases, they hired people explicitly for remote work, right? And I think to some extent, they've been doing mass layoffs pretty explicitly. I think this can be seen as a way to do that without worrying about things like severance. But I think it's pretty obvious that these companies are trying to slim down, especially in certain departments. And I think with the rise of generative AI, we're also seeing how they're just sort of shifting their strategy. So I think it's definitely true that to some extent they are hoping for some attrition and turnover. And there have been surveys and reports that indicate that CEOs kind of understand that that's part of the game and that's almost what they're looking for in some cases. In some situations, it's been really explicit, right? I mean, Elon Musk has been very clear that that is the goal of pulling back on the federal workforce and so on and bringing them back to the office. And so I think he just kind of said the quiet part out loud, right? He said what a lot of CEOs are thinking. And I think it's absolutely true that that's one of the elements that's driving this decision.
We got to talk about Jamie Dimon, who, after receiving a petition from, I think it was 950 employees, and caveat, JP Morgan has so many employees that is actually not a massive percentage of the company.
Yeah.
Signed a petition saying they didn't want to return to office. He basically said, I don't give a fuck about how many people signed this petition.
And don't give me the shit that work from home Friday works. I call a lot of people on Friday. There's not a goddamn person to get a hold of.
Tell me about the sort of employee organizing efforts that we've seen and how those are going.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's tough here is that at-will employees don't have a lot of legal recourse, right? Your boss can tell you you have to return to the office, even if you were a full-time remote employee previously, and there's not much you can do about it. So I do think that's why we're seeing this petition and we're seeing a lot of like vocal dissent from employees. And that's been true at tech companies like Amazon as well. These are not companies where employees have historically spoken out and been really vocal about their discontent. And we have seen a real shift there, I think, in the culture over the last couple of years. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think people feel like they're being treated like children and aren't being allowed to kind of work in the way that is best for them. And so I think we've seen a lot of just vocal dissent from employees, but not so much in the way of like legal pushback, just because there isn't a whole lot they can do. I would say it's really only specific situations where an employee has a real legal case. So if they had like some sort of medical issue or medical accommodations, then maybe they could actually pursue legal action. But I think in most situations, they're at-will employees and they just don't have much to sort of push back on. And so they're using the avenues that they can.
Now, Diamond actually said one of his criticisms is that some staff did not pay attention during Zoom meetings.
Looking at your mail, sending texts to each other about what an asshole the other person is. Okay, not paying attention.
Diamond also, at the same time, asked all of his departments to show 10% gains in efficiency, which means 10% cut in reports, 10% cut in meetings, 10% cut in documents and training sessions, which is always funny to me because you are implying that meetings are not efficient while saying people are not paying attention during Zoom meetings. But I am curious, about this perspective. Do you see that as sort of a common thread between CEOs, or what are they saying, even though it may not necessarily be what they actually believe?
I mean, I think there's definitely a common thread in the sort of we need to be together in person in order to be collaborative, as if people have not been doing that remotely for, well before the pandemic as well, right? I mean, there's a lack of understanding, I think, as to what the experience is actually like being in the office. I mean, that's why you see all of these CEOs also saying, we need to be back, but there aren't enough desks for people. But I think what Jamie Dimon said is maybe a little bit more explicit, right? And again, kind of saying what a lot of CEOs are probably saying behind closed doors, which I guess is what he was doing as well. But I think he was just being a bit more explicit about it than many others. But I think, yes, that is kind of the prevailing sentiment, is that this is just a way to make people more efficient. I don't know that I've seen the 10% gains in efficiency or putting a real number to it. So that's interesting. And again, I wonder if it's a way to just kind of throw metrics behind it and make a stronger case for doing this.
You actually wrote a piece a while ago about Gen Z workers and sort of the perception of them in the office. And when I hear somebody like Jamie Dimon being like, people aren't paying attention to Zooms, it does sound like something of an ageist complaint. It's got some kind of vibes there. What can you say about sort of the younger generation and how they're responding to all of this?
So many of these younger workers came into the workplace in just such a unusual way, right? Many of them were either starting fully remotely or coming into the office maybe a few days a week, depending on when in the last few years they might have started working. But I think it's such a strange introduction to the workplace. For many younger workers, a Zoom meeting might be very normal, right? And it doesn't strike them as weird. And they actually might be very good at paying attention and also probably working at the same time. So really, overall, they're being more productive.
That's the thing. Half the time, you're answering Slacks when you're on a Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Isn't that more productive?
Yeah, especially
That's
during
what I say.
During a brainstorm. Sorry. I am often answering Slacks.
No, absolutely. And so I think, it feels very tone deaf, I think, to say that people are not paying attention because they're on a Zoom meeting. And I think for younger workers, they've had a certain amount of flexibility, and it's very hard to just kind of take that back. But I think the finance sector is tough. All of these companies are trying to go back to the office 5 days a week, right? So somebody like Jamie Dimon, I think, just feels like what he's doing is not unusual and that he's kind of entitled to.
I think that's definitely true. Although it has occurred to me, during the pandemic, I felt like so many CEOs were saying, well, now we have the privilege of being able to hire the best people, regardless of where they are.
Yeah.
And I'm like, surely that would be a competitive advantage at a time when every financial service is going back to the office.
Yeah.
But maybe
you'd think
I'm
so.
wrong. Yeah.
No. I mean, that's a great point because Citigroup, for example, has kind of framed it that way. I think they're one of the only banks that is still allowing some hybrid work. So I believe it's 3 days in the office. And they've tried to use that as we're a better place for women and caregivers to work and so on. And so, I do think it's still a competitive advantage. And I also think one thing that I should mention is many of these companies prior to the pandemic, and this is maybe more tech rather than finance, but there was a lot of flexibility at these companies, even
Yeah.
before people moved to remote work, right? People worked from home, and that was not considered really unusual. And if you had an appointment and needed to be home that day, that was generally fine at many tech companies. And so I think people are also frustrated that they're effectively moving to not even what they had pre-pandemic,
Yeah.
but to a much stricter in-office policy.
One thing that cracked me up, and I will raise my hand and say I have been guilty of this sometimes, but it's because I need to get work done, is
Yes.
people just deciding not to come in, even if there is
I've done it too.
even if there is a sort of return to office mandate, and that may be the reason why more strict rules are now put in place. What can you say about that?
I think that's absolutely true. And that was something that came up when I spoke to legal experts about this, is that these companies thought when they implemented these like 3 days a week in the office policies that people would show up, right? and abide by them. And I think they found that no, people, I think, were very accustomed to that flexibility. And it was much harder to get them back in the office if they allowed for some flexibility rather than kind of explicitly mandating it. So I do think part of what's driving these very strict policies is just seeing that people are not going to do it unless you make it mandatory. And then also in some cases, unless you tie it to performance to some extent, right? So we are also seeing companies that have said explicitly that it is going to be evaluated as part of your performance review, or you might not be eligible for a promotion if you decide to work remotely, which is also, a whole other thing. And I think could open them up to some other legal risks, which we can talk about.
There's also the element of, you mentioned bosses calling people back to the office despite there not being enough desks sometimes. There's also the element of seeing a bunch of empty desks and feeling like they have to justify why they even have this office in the first place.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Some of these companies spent billions of dollars on really fancy campuses, right? And in some cases that coincided with the pandemic, essentially. And so I think there is absolutely a part of this that is probably driven by having spent a lot of money on these campuses or having very expensive leases. But it's also interesting because if there aren't enough desks, that means you were never kind of built to accommodate the workforce that you now have, which again, probably is because of overhiring during the pandemic. So it's all connected. But I definitely think that is one piece of it. And we've seen companies like Amazon where they wanted people to be back by, I think, January 1st originally, or the first week of January. And then they couldn't bring people back to every office because in some locations they just didn't have enough desks. Or maybe people are going back to the office, but they can't get a seat or they can't get a private space.
Yeah, I was going to say that everybody talks about not enough desks, but the not enough Zoom rooms is like the real thing at this point.
Right. I mean, there's people who are back in the office and not actually with their team, or like they're not working, alongside the team that they should be. And so they're still on Zoom calls at the office. And there's been like several reports of cases where people are not even with their direct manager in the same office. And so you have to wonder, how is that more productive or collaborative?
Also, nobody's figured out how not to cycle audio and have audio feedback when you're taking they're like, everyone's just going to be on the Zoom call now in this room with the few people that are remote. And then it's just nonstop people being like, can you mute your mic? No, this person needs to mute your mic. You need to go through there. Maybe a little bit of tech issues that need to still be worked out, but that still comes down to the IT department.
Yeah, but also these are tech companies, so it's all very funny.
There's no excuse.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the legal risks you mentioned. You wrote a whole piece about this, but what are some of the legal risks that companies face when they mandate a strict return to office policy?
There's a few different things. I think before we talk about the legal part, I mean, there's obviously this huge issue of employee morale, right?
Yep.
And we've seen this again in all of the frustrations and very vocal dissent from employees. And so I think first, there's that really major challenge. And I think people are obviously leaving over these policies, especially really senior employees who have a lot more leverage. But the other issue is that some of these employees are being granted exemptions or exceptions, right? Especially if it's the kind of employee that a company doesn't want to lose, then chances are they're going to be more willing to allow them to work from home or give them more flexibility. And I think that's where it gets tricky from a legal perspective. If you're offering some employees those benefits and not others, like if you have a senior white male employee who's being allowed to kind of work in a more flexible way, but then you have disabled employees or women or caregivers who are not being granted any sort of exceptions, I think that can open you up to potential legal issues. And then I would just say generally the issues around accommodations, the minute you implement a really, really strict 5 days a week policy, I think it gets tricky in terms of like ensuring you're complying with like disability accommodations, right? And we've seen this happening. There have been reports of this happening at companies like Amazon, where as they've decided to bring people back to the office 5 days a week, they're also kind of cracking down on disability accommodations. And so, again, I think that's a place where you could pretty easily open yourself up to legal claims. And I think we'll start to see more of this as like these policies are in place for longer. We will probably start to see an increase in discrimination claims and disability claims in particular. Several legal experts have said to me that they're anticipating seeing that. So we'll see. But I think those are the kind of main challenges for companies, and I'm not sure if all of them are thinking about this, right, or are like equipped to deal with this. They might just be thinking they'll, see what happens and deal with it as it comes. But I think this is something a lot of companies should be thinking about.
And to be clear, that risk for litigation was sort of always there, right? But this has kind of brought it to the fore, maybe gives more people reason to do a lawsuit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. I think it was always there. I think that during the pandemic, though, we did see a lot of accommodations being made for some of these employees who might have had more challenges getting them in the past. What's tricky is that if you can sort of prove that you are providing some kind of like a reasonable accommodation, it's not necessarily illegal to deny like somebody the ability to work from home, right? And so that's where it gets very complicated. Like you are not automatically entitled to be able to work from home just because you have a disability. And I think companies are probably more likely to like lean on that now than they might have been a couple of years ago.
Another point which you just raised is that, star employees may still be able to kind of negotiate their working arrangement. Would this potentially cause more lawsuits? Like, how does that fit into everything?
I mean, I think it could, right? Again, I think if it's a situation where someone is able to prove like this person got an accommodation and I didn't, I do think they could have a case, right? Or if, let's say, a company that ties like performance to in-office attendance, if you're not getting promoted or if you're not getting a certain kind of review, like I do think there could be some basis for that, right? So it gets very complicated, I think, when you do what I want to say it was Dell that did this, where they basically said, like, you can work remotely, but if you do so, you are not eligible for promotion. Like, I do think that could get very complicated if the people who are working remotely tend to be the kinds of folks who need certain accommodations, right? Or like need more flexibility. You could open yourself up to a discrimination suit there. I'm not sure companies are thinking this way just yet.
That makes a lot of sense.
And they might just be waiting. Yeah.
You mentioned a lot of at-will employees don't have many avenues for organizing, but some employees at JP Morgan looked into setting up a labor union. I mean, tell me about that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It sounds like they reached out to the Communications Workers of America.
It was just like 2 employees.
Yeah, what I mean? I was about to say. I don't know that this is, a real groundswell here, but it sounds like there were a couple of employees who reached out just trying to figure out if they might be able to set up a union, which is very interesting for finance employees. Yeah, really funny.
Are there finance institutions that have unions? I'm completely ignorant on this.
No, not that. I mean, not
really
that I know of.
I wouldn't have thought so, but I mean, it would have been weird if it was like Bear Stearns was until, all went downhill.
Can you imagine? Yeah, no, not that I know of. I mean, in tech, obviously, we've seen organizing, but even in tech, it's like many of these employees don't actually have contracts, right? So they don't have any RTO policies sort of enshrined in a contract. If there was a case where an employee was a unionized employee, yes, there might be certain protections in the contract that they could fall back on, and maybe they can file something with NLRB. But that's probably one of the only situations where you have some kind of recourse.
Now, at the same time as these RTO mandates are coming through, we're seeing some rollback of DEI policies. Something that you wrote about that was interesting to me is that a lot of companies, I think Disney's one of them, are sort of reframing the language around their policies, but not necessarily making that many, substantive changes. Yeah. What can you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that's getting a little bit lost in all the coverage of like the DEI rollbacks, which is that not every company is doing the same thing. I think from the outside, all we have to go off of are these company announcements, right? And so you're trying to parse, what they're doing based on that. But without having kind of insight into what's happening within the company, I think it can be hard to tell exactly what this means. So I think some of the DEI experts I've spoken to are actually surprisingly more optimistic than I would have anticipated and don't feel like, DEI is being gutted across the board. I think there's definitely some companies that are kind of saying one thing internally and then saying something else externally, right? So they're putting out these announcements that make it look like they're pulling back on DEI, or maybe they're getting rid of a certain part of the team, or I don't know, making certain cosmetic changes, and reality might actually be quite different. So Disney was an interesting one because I think they said that they were changing how they kind of consider DEI in hiring, if I recall correctly.
And in executive compensation.
Yes, and tying it to executive compensation, right. And what's interesting is they're not explicitly using, I think, DEI as a criteria anymore, but they're using like talent strategy, which includes like DEI practice.
Right.
So I think there's several examples of that where if you were to look closer or if you were to talk to people who are actually doing this work at these companies, I think you might find that there isn't as much of a pullback on DEI as it might seem from the outside. But what's also tough is like so many of these companies were never that committed in the first place. So
totally.
It's hard to say that they were ever that committed to begin with, and what they're doing now is just kind of a change in language or semantics. I think we have to keep in mind that there have been very few that have like really made strong commitments and actually have results to show for it.
Do you have a sense of like, beyond just changing languages, I guess like how companies can stay committed to this effort without running afoul of like the government or displeasing Trump?
First of all, I think one big thing to remember, which I think many of these companies with, sophisticated legal teams are aware of, is just that Trump can only do so much.
Yeah.
He can dictate certain things when it comes to the federal workforce, but he cannot really tell private sector companies what they can and can't do. And so even the language in his executive orders around we're going to go after private sector companies or we're going to open investigations into private sector companies, there's a lot of questions as to whether any of that is really legally sound and whether he has the authority to do that. So I think there's that first. And I think many of these companies are pretty aware of that and recognize that there isn't a real legal risk. But that being said, nobody really wants to deal with frivolous lawsuits.
Yeah.
And I think especially larger employers are very, very aware of that. And so there are a few different things that companies are doing now. Like we're seeing some places kind of pause some of these initiatives, which again, I know sounds very bad, but I think it's not the worst thing to kind of vet these programs, right? And make sure that they are kind of above board. And then in other cases, they're ensuring that the programs that they do have are actually kind of strengthened, because I think the other flip side of this is like you might open yourself up to actually more discrimination suits from marginalized communities if, let's say, you were to completely pull back on DEI, right? So in some ways, like DEI initiatives are actually protective and like they've decreased the number of lawsuits that companies have seen from certain employees. And so I think we're seeing both sides of it, like companies taking a harder look at their existing programs and kind of auditing them. And then we've also seen companies, I think, strengthening certain types of programs. And then I think there's some that like we've already started to see this over the last year or so that are just a little more legally like risky. And so programs that are like fellowships for specific groups, you'll notice that some companies have changed their language to be like, this is now open to anybody. And some of that is just like a protective measure from a legal perspective. So I think we'll see some changes maybe to certain programs like that. But for the most part, I don't think the legal risk from these executive orders is nearly as dire as it might seem.
Well, thank you so much, Pavithra.
Yeah.
We'll be back with Pavithra Mohan for Keeping Tabs, but first, a quick break followed by my interview with Fast Company's global design editor, Mark Wilson.
Loom helps your team have fewer, better meetings. Use video messages to share quick context or feedback between meetings. And add Loom AI to your calendar for instant meeting notes and recordings. Try Loom today at loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
Time to make millennials feel old. And I'm a millennial, by the way. I feel like I said that as if I was Gen Z. The Sims officially launched 25 years ago, and the PC game, which is now on version 4, is just as popular as ever. I talked with Fast Company's global design editor and frequent MIC guest Mark Wilson about the game's lasting impact and popularity. So Mark, welcome to the show again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to talk about The Sims, mostly to know if you played The Sims.
So I played, I believe, Sims 2. I don't know. I played around, I would say around like 2006 was my Sims heyday. And I think I mentioned this before, but I always played one character. It was a single man named Don Lothario, which I did think was a guy named Don, but I now realize was something else. And his goal was to have a woohoo in a hot tub with two women. That was what drove him. And he consistently died because he'd say he was hungry. I'd be like, okay, go make lunch. And then his microwave would catch on fire. Never knew what to do.
I like how you have separated yourself from the Dong persona entirely. You only played Action.
Don can't be me. Me changing my Slack name to Don Lothario. What was your relationship with The Sims?
So, I first played The Sims like right when it came out in 2000, and it was one of those games where nobody really knew what it was, but
Yeah.
I was a big PC gamer growing up,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of my friends weren't, and all of a sudden they were all playing The Sims, which was like strange.
You mentioned in your piece, and I thought this was a really interesting insight, like, it's not a game you can win. You know what I mean?
No, it's a time burner, right? It's
Yeah.
like one of those games that you kind of sign on and you're wondering what you're doing with your life. And what you're doing with your life, right, is running like this virtual dollhouse with different characters. You can literally arrange their homes, decorate them very HGTV style. And, that's what the game was at the time. And, like a lot of the games that Will Wright, the designer, made, people didn't understand it exactly when it came out. Will Wright was the mind behind SimCity, where you could build towns, which sounds like the most boring thing in a way, but it really fascinated players, right? To like be able to construct an entire city. And so The Sims was sort of his take on SimCity, I think, for like interpersonal relationships and the suburban level of the SimCity.
Now, gaming's changed a lot through the years, but weirdly, and this is the premise of your piece, Sims hasn't. You know what I mean? Like, it's made
Yeah.
some changes, but like the basic thing that you do is still the same. What about its design has made it so consistently popular?
So The Sims has evolved a bit from Sims 1 to 4, but if you're a Sims 1 player who transported 20 years in the future, you would still recognize the game 100%, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
What I was told when I talked to two people who had been with the series since the jump, they said the key is that you're taking care of something else, and that's the anchor.
And like you could take care of your kids or volunteer somewhere else, but
No.
guess...
That's not part of the business plan. Um, Exactly. And so it does it like the game kind of pulls on those like natural instincts I think we do have, right? To like care for something, whatever that is. And that's a base premise. And something Will Wright had said was with The Sims 1, the Sims were like too autonomous and they could take care of themselves and the game was totally boring.
It's true.
So he had to make sure they could catch fire or pee themselves if they didn't go to the bathroom. And that suddenly made the game have a hook. And, between The Sims 1 and 4, they went from having these very specific keep your Sims alive kind of goals to Sims 2 as more like, can you help them reach existential bliss? And you could actually like lose the game in existential crisis, which is a little too close to real life for me.
Yeah.
Then Sims 3 and 4 become more just like this sandbox where you're almost Real Housewives seeing the world. You get a bunch of people together at a mixer and you kind of watch chaos ensue.
Something that I liked when I read your piece and hadn't occurred to me before is that, I always assume that humans will do probably like the worst thing possible. Like I can imagine people logging onto Sims and just setting people on fire and watching it. And it doesn't seem like that's the case. Like it's a weirdly dramatic but kind of nice realm. Politics are not involved.
Without mods, my understanding is there's no politics involved.
Yeah.
It's interesting. A lot of games have this dark path you can take.
Yeah.
And when you look at gameplay and the way people actually play games, only like 5% of players end up going the dark path. And developers spend so much time investing in that path.
Yeah.
That there's some debate if they should at all. And I think The Sims is really kind of illustrative of that, right? Like it does have this core sort of Tamagotchi like game loop going on, but ultimately, people play it in a way that is exploring storylines that I think are largely innocuous.
Yeah.
You get in a fight that is very vague. You can bring up a topic by clicking on word bubbles with real words, but like the fight that comes back is in form of an emoji and Simlish, which is just gibberish.
Hey, how Bobby need me? But the wrong days, geeky body.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this use of emojis and Simlets, because something I loved about your piece was when you talk about it as a game of interpretation. So you even had executives being like, people really read into this a lot, but we are doing nothing very profound here. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they did. They talked about playing with fans who will, when they do this with playtests, right? They'll recite like all this stuff happened, like there was all this family drama, and Jacqueline inherited all the money, and well, yeah, you can read it that way. But that is by design. Everything's a little bit vague. Nothing happens is like highly scripted. Everything's probabilistic. And ultimately, using like very vague symbology allows it to be like any comic strip, your mind fills in a lot of blanks. They're just widening the gap of how many blanks you fill in.
And though politics aren't involved, you can be in pretty fluid relationships, and that's always been the case, right?
Yeah, from 2000, like you could be in a same gender relationship, which at the time was somewhat radical. And I think over a few decades, it's been seen as like very progressive in that way. Even to this day, everything in the game isn't necessarily labeled, but now they actually have deep sort of drop down systems where you can say, like, is my character a polygamist or not? Based upon their gender fluidity, could they even breastfeed or something like that? And I think that's a lot of people to have representation within the system. But at the same time, polyamory within the system, I was told, is really just like an absence of jealousy as a gameplay mechanic. Again, like these very sort of loosely interpreted rules become something that is interpreted to a player as something that's very meaningful.
This is a hypothetical, but I am curious, is anything illegal in the sim world? Like, if you beat the crap out of someone, do you suffer any consequences, or is it just like...
I don't know. I have not been a deviant in The Sims at that level in a long time. No, I played Sims 1 and I loaded Sims 4 for the piece, and honestly, like playing the beginning of it, I was reminded that like the pace of the game is like actually a little too slow for me.
It's really slow.
Yeah, and I don't want to speed it up because like I want to optimize everything, obviously. But the game was kind of slow and I was playing it, and then I kind of walked off. So good question. I don't know the answer for you. Sorry.
You mentioned they're super long storylines, so you may have generations of a Sims family fighting over inheritance or what have you. Tell me about how the game does that. How far can you sort of customize or extend a storyline?
They introduced having children in the game. People can sort of die, and so you can have this long tail sort of generational things that happen. And basically, EA designers saw that people were playing the game that way. You could build a neighborhood and have several families that were like living generation after generation. And the game is free to play now, and that's really helped its growth. But obviously, they want to generate revenue, and the revenue is really generated at this point through expansion packs. And so when they see the behavior like that, like, oh, wow, like people are interested in this, and they're kind of trying to build storylines around generational wealth and things like that.
Yeah.
They then designed and released a sort of death and taxes kind of like add-on where they actually created those scenarios where you would be attending a funeral, right? You might be in an office and sort of like potentially debating over family legacy, again, in Simlish, very vaguely, but really like setting these sort of scenes for interpretation.
It's so interesting. I feel like we're a few days away from an essay in The Cut being like, I had an incestuous relationship with my dad and then he died. Here's how The Sims like help me process all of that or something. But something I didn't realize until I read your piece was that the game went free to play in 2022. Can you talk to me about Sims' business model? You mentioned the sort of expansion packs.
Sims 4 itself is like a decade old at this point. And there are some games that can basically last a decade and keep making money. A lot of their players had fallen off, but I think they hit that COVID-esque moment where a lot of games are going to free to play. They switched, and all of a sudden, they got tens of millions of players, a very captive audience. You see a huge spike online. That's when the game eventually reaches like 85 million players. And they do have some drop off, and they had some drop off in the coming years, but they've actually kind of recovered that. So a lot of people are still playing The Sims 4, and you can even go onto Steam and see like tens of thousands of people in the game at any time. So it's not as big as like phenomenons right now, like Marvel Rivals or something that just made, I think, over $1 billion since launch. But it has like a really active community that does seem to be investing in like expansion packs and continued play.
I am surprised actually that they haven't pursued brand collaborations. You know, I think about Roblox and Fortnite and the sort of easy money. Was that a point of conversation? Is that something they think about?
No, I wish I'd asked more about it. I mean, I think you're totally right. Why there isn't more brand placement there. They
Yeah.
have tried some other business models. There was a Sims Online experience for a while, a few years ago, that was like click farming. You know, it was like you do something and then you waited. That whole model was really big for a while. I think people obviously like it wasn't sticky.
Yeah.
They walked away from it. But I totally agree. Brand collaborations are sort of a perfect extension. The only thing about The Sims, though, is, you know, a lot of games, like I just mentioned Marvel Rivals, their business plan is they sell you in-item games, like
Mhm.
kind of indirectly like Roblox,
Yeah.
right? And so like people pay $20 essentially to buy a new skin.
Mhm.
In The Sims, really the items are in-game currency, and you know they haven't pushed that switch, I think, as aggressively as some games have. You know, maybe it could work. Like maybe collabs would be really big, maybe not. And it's amazing because gamers are just so demanding and feel slighted depending on so many different decisions they make that I feel like anything they do right now is a bit of a risk, and doing
Yeah.
nothing obviously is a bit of a risk.
That makes a lot of sense. In terms of who the Sims players are now, are they children who don't know what Lothario means? Or are they older people who now do?
Oh, look, I don't know. I don't know the core demographic of The Sims, to be totally honest, yes.
Mhm.
But I imagine it's relatively expansive.
You talked about how survivability was the focus of 1 and 2. Now, for a young player who's starting, that doesn't seem like the biggest goal. Is that fair to say?
100%. Like your sim can essentially die, but more in funny ways. It's really hard for them to die because you aren't feeding them enough, right? And
Right.
so, like, tuning the knobs on those gameplay mechanics is really all about making sure that your sims had time to interact with other sims. And I think that's where you introduce all of those storyline and gameplay things where people like play longer term in a hopefully like a less compulsive way, that being like glued to your computer, making sure that you're like going to the bathroom in time before the pee meter like goes too high, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's still a pretty solitary game, right? Or do you see people playing together?
I think it's like a largely solitary game. And it's interesting because there have been leaks about Project Renee, which is sort of the
Project
future for.
Renee, can I just say, is such a funny name.
Is it appealing to you? Yes. Do you feel like they
It sounds like a plan to help a suburban mom. You know, like
it's like they had Project Karen, but they're like, we gotta tweak it. It's
exactly.
too on the nose. Mimosas and petties at Project Renee.
But sorry, I interrupted you.
So Project Renee is essentially through leaks and some admissions that EA has had is not going to be Sims 5 formally, but it is kind of an evolution of what it could be. It's a take on perhaps like an open world Sims. You know, I've seen reports that maybe it's a way of gluing other Sims worlds together. I think it'll be very interesting to see what EA actually does because they've had some pushback to leaks and supposed playtests. I feel like this is a franchise that gained a lot of goodwill and they don't want to burn it, and that's
Mhm.
really tricky to do. And a lot of game franchises like have been burning goodwill recently. So yeah, it would be very interesting to see how it develops.
What else can you say about the future of the franchise?
The only other thing we really know is they just re-released Sims 1 and 2. So
Yeah.
if you have any interest in like going back to that compulsive keep this human alive gameplay, dig in. But yeah, other than that, I could imagine them releasing a lot more packs for Sims 4, honestly. Like there's really no reason for them to stop releasing add-on packs for Sims 4 because the effort for generating those is honestly relatively low. And, you know, I have a feeling there are people who will buy each and every one of them that come out.
Did you ever play Second Life?
I did. You know, I only like toured Second Life. I wouldn't say
Mhm.
like I played it.
Yeah.
Did you?
No, but there's a fantastic Atlantic article about the people who are still on Second Life today. And they're people who get up in the morning, pack their kids to school, spend 9 hours there. And it seems like a sort of dark-sided Sims in some way.
Oh, I mean, 100%. Early in my career, I was a video game journalist for
Mhm.
Kotaku. And a person I worked with, like, we split a room when we were like covering gaming events. And he brought his gaming laptop. And I would say he would like wake up at like 6 a.m., log into Second Life before going out and reporting for the day. And I know he had quit Second Life for a while, but was sort of pulled back in. But, you know, like these online spaces become communities for people. And as like dark as that sounds, he had a community there.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's better than joining like QAnon, right? So
I mean, depending, like you could be on the QAnon Second
you
Life
could you
people.
could
Yeah,
be
yeah,
on the
yeah.
QAnon Second Life. It's got to be crazy.
That's real dark. Yeah, that's the real dark timeline. That's the only way I want to play Second Life. I want to go full in or just not at all, I feel like.
My last question, I guess, is about Sims' legacy. You know, you spoke to the creator, and I think I've said this on the podcast before. My husband is like a big PC gamer, but he only plays management games. He'll be like, sorry, I'm managing a hospital. Please leave me alone. Or
So
like,
yeah,
I'm
keeping people alive.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, exactly. Or like, sorry, I'm a city planner. Our sewage system's not going well. I can't pay attention to Love Island right now. That seems like an extension of The Sims to me. But what can you say about Sims' lasting legacy?
Oh gosh, there's such a Venn diagram between some of these things, right? There's like the management game, the
Yeah.
hospital management game. So you have like the Sims on the left, you have the hospital management game in the
Yeah.
middle, and then on the far right, you have the factory management games.
Yep.
I don't know if your husband's got into those.
He's done those. He played one that I couldn't get over where beavers were harvesting sheet metal to like rebuild their lives after the apocalypse that was like very factory simulation based.
There you go. There you go.
Like,
So he's getting there. Just give it 6 more months.
yeah.
You know, I think The Sims does play to some of those compulsions because it's a video game. But I do think if it has like a lasting legacy, I will say that I think its place in sexuality and gender from 2000 on was a sort of bright spot in gaming that has been really good for communities, but at the same time really toxic. And
Yeah.
so like, I think it was like on the right side of all of that. I'm really curious though what they do for the next 10 or 20 years, because I do think Sims gameplay probably has to evolve and broaden and sort of deepen if they want to continue scaling. And just the other truth is they are seeing more competitors in the market internationally. This is sort of a clonable system now. And I think at this point, like they have a very strong brand, but I don't think that any single gaming legacy can survive without really tweaking the experience in gameplay.
Well, Mark, this was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Load up that Sims.
Oh my God. Don Lothario is back, baby.
Yeah, the song's back in the game.
Threesome
Back in the house.
incoming. Okay, we are back with Pavithra, and it's time to wrap up the show with Keeping Tabs. This is where each one of us shares a story, trend, or bit of pop culture we're following right now. And Pavithra, since you're our guest, what are you keeping tabs on?
Well, I'm barely keeping tabs on Love is Blind because it's so boring this season, but I simply cannot help myself from watching.
We just needed more, what's her name, Madison?
Yes, we really needed Yes.
Have you looked up her
absolutely.
art? It's not good.
It's not good. Is she actually an
I
artist?
did see that girl who were talking. She said she was an artist like 17 times in one episode. Maybe it's just she kept just mentioning she was an artist.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's bad. It's gonna be bad. I know it's gonna be bad art.
Yeah, it's all over Reddit. That's how I found it.
Okay.
To be clear, I didn't like Google it, but I do follow many Love is Blind subreddits, so here I am.
Yeah, they spent so much time on her, and then, nothing really came of that.
Well, it's
Not to give
because
it away
like
for anyone.
but then I watched the rest of the show and I was like, yeah, no wonder they spent time on her because like
The
it's
rest
so
is
boring.
Yeah.
Well, could they have spent more time on the Maha girl, the girl who was definitely had
The
RFK
one who was
Jr.
the one who
vibes?
was like,
Oh,
I
yeah.
believe we could actually control the weather.
Yeah,
Yes,
that one.
yes.
Yeah.
Did she cite the Joe Rogan podcast? Yes, she did. I think it's the same.
Yeah, she did cite the Joe Rogan podcast.
She was like kind of a legend. And she ended up with the alien guy. I was like, alien people belong together. I think you have, And like, what was the other? Oh, the one interesting aspect of this show to me was the way that people discussed politics. So I felt like, the one who was like a dancer and her, fiance, who I think is a coach, had a kind of an interesting discussion last week.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's the one who, I'm sorry, there's like the funniest meme on Reddit, which is that blonde lady wearing a kente cloth saying, "What have you done for black people today?" But because she's like constantly asking about anti-racism and anti-LGBT stuff, which is great, to be clear. But
Yes.
I feel like this guy she's with, like, is so done with her questions.
Oh, yeah. She also, she asked all this, and then he gave, like, the most tepid response. And she was like, all right, that's good enough.
Yeah. She was like, okay,
She's
well,
like, I'll
take
try
it.
I think I heard that conversation where it's like, I've been watching it in the periphery because my wife's watching it. I usually do tune in, but I didn't. Is he the guy who was like, I'll try to get there on these issues? Was that his response?
I think so.
Something like that?
He also was like, I've never really thought about
it,
this.
yeah.
And she was like, how? We're in Minneapolis.
I think maybe she just needed to feel like heard or recognized, but didn't necessarily need him to like really agree. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
No, you might be right.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? Did they move on? Did they stay together or did they?
We'll find out next
From
week
what
if
we
they
know.
got
Still going?
married.
Yeah, we don't know if they got married. They did stay together. So they made
That
it
guy-
out of the
Okay.
pods.
What the hell was his name? Dave? Huge piece of shit.
Oh, he's awful. Yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oof. I was like, run, girl.
Was this actually going to be your keeping tabs, Pavithra? Because it almost sounded like you were going to pivot to something else, and then we just kept you on
Sorry.
this.
No, we can stick with this. We're good. I'm barely keeping tabs, like I said. I mean, otherwise it would be White Lotus. So here we are.
Word.
I don't like White Lotus.
Yeah,
Oh, not for me.
Josh famously hates
Yeah.
White Lotus. I think it's fine. I don't love it as much as everybody else, but I do.
Yeah, I was actually going to say I wouldn't be praising this season exactly.
No.
But I do. I have a
Okay.
long-standing crush on Jason Isaacs, and I am glad other people.
Oh.
Oh.
Nobody else really agrees, but that's okay. I told Max I thought he was hot, and Max was like, "He looks like every divorced guy in Scranton." It's like,
Well, I
I
mean,
was like,
Jason Isaacs is pretty hot. I think that's
he's hot.
really
I think
arguable.
he's really hot. Whatever.
Yeah.
The Harry
How about
Potter
that
wig.
accent?
Yeah, the Harry Potter wig did him so dirty.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And also, he based
That was
his
bleak.
character on the most despicable person on Southern Charm. So many layers
Oh,
to his
amazing.
performance. Josh, what are you keeping tabs?
Well, we're recording this on Monday just after the Oscars, and I guess I'm keeping tabs on that because we talked about it a couple weeks ago with Katie Rich. And overall, I'm usually pretty cynical about awards shows. It was an enjoyable awards show. Conan O'Brien did a great job. I thought the opening number was fun and like a good way to do it. The 007 dance with Margaret Qualley was a little weird. That was a whole thing.
Yeah, they've always got a moment like that where you're just like, what?
There's always something like that, but like, yeah, there were a lot of good bits. It was legit funny. They had good presenters. It always is too long, but overall, pretty good production of a show. And also like there was no like weird winners overall. I'm not like the biggest Honora fan, but it's a good
Yeah.
movie and good for Honora, good for Adrian Brody. Yeah, fun show. That's just my kind of delightful. This wasn't a train wreck. Like it sometimes is overall. So I'll keep that short and sweet. Yaz, what are you keeping tabs on?
So this was part of the Oscars telecast, and I've said this before, I'm a big fan of Adrian Brody because my husband gets mistaken for him on a semi-regular basis, and I find both of them very hot. But he did this thing, so this got cut out of our previous recording. He's dating Harvey Weinstein's ex-wife, which is already wild.
Oh.
Very strange
Yeah, that's
relationship.
weird.
And he did this thing as he
Yeah.
was walking up to accept his award. He took some gum out of his mouth and like threw it to her because I guess he realized he should have taken it out earlier. And she like kind of failed to catch it in a funny way, but it's also disgusting. So I've just been thinking about that a lot and like how upsetting that was. And also how I would react if my husband threw some gum at me. I'd probably like run away because I wouldn't want
Yeah,
it to
that's
get.
pretty gross.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
wouldn't
that's
want it to
really
get in my
gross.
hair.
Oh
Just-
yeah, that's true. I didn't even think
That's
about
awful.
that. So many things could go wrong.
Yeah.
And then you're at the after party with like peanut butter in your hair because you're trying to get it out. And
At the same
it's a
time,
whole thing.
if you're in Adrian Brody's position and you're like, damn it, I forgot to take my gum out and now I have to give this
What do you
speech.
do?
Like, what do you do?
Honestly, I feel like
There's
you gotta
no other
just
option.
push it up into your gum and try to get through it.
But it's your
Or
Oscar
take it out,
speech.
put it on the bottom of the Oscar.
Yeah.
Or put it in your pocket. Just put it in your pocket.
Yeah.
No.
It's
oh,
gross.
No.
Well, okay, your options aren't great. You know what they should do? Just pull a Star is Born and just piss yourself on the stage.
Oh, that's so upsetting. Yeah. So the gum is like the least bad thing you have to deal with.
Yeah, and then you take the gum out and you stick it underneath the podium. Just hand it. Who was handing out the award? It was Cillian Murphy. Just hand it to Cillian.
Just spit it out. Just spit it
Ooh.
out on your way up. Apologize to the
yeah.
cleaners. It's
Yeah.
fine, you know? But it's funny because I feel like last time he won an Oscar, he like forcibly made out
Yeah.
with Halle Berry.
Oh yeah.
Well, but they
Uh-huh.
recreated the kiss this time around, which made me feel like better about the previous
It's
incident.
okay now, yeah.
But I was like, dude, you can't get this right. Like, You're always
No,
doing something
no.
weird, and I do empathize with that. But
And then he did the quintessential, no, turn off the music. I'll finish. This is
Oh,
my
I know.
moment sort of
yes.
thing. Which I'm always like, all right, that's fine. But to be fair, they did let Kieran Culkin go on for a while.
yeah,
and it
because
was
he's
very
funny.
It was very funny, but I was like, ooh, this is going to cut into someone's speech later. And it did. And it was Adrian Brody, and he was having none of it.
And that's it for Most Innovative Companies. Pavithra, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our show is produced by Avery Miles and Blake Odom with help from Sam Gebauer and Hawa Atori, editing by Matt Toder, mix and sound design by Nicholas Torres, and our executive producer is Josh Christensen. Remember again to subscribe, rate, and review, and we'll see you next week.
Save time, communicate better with your team, and get more done with Loom.